It's day 2 of the candidates, and Richard Rapport was facing Alireza Firouzja with white here. We had a very fighting game. Let's see what happened. So Rapport kicked off with e4, and Alireza goes for the Sicilian defence, very fighting, as I suspected he would. And after knight to f3, pawn d6, Rapport goes for the open variation here. Alireza captures, and now here's the first interesting moment. Rapport retakes with the queen here, not the standard knight recaptures. Now this allows black to develop against that queen with tempo. Why is Rapport doing this? Well, what he's got planned here is this bishop to b5. He pins that knight, Alireza kicks the bishop, and now he actually gives up that bishop pair there. Alireza recaptures, so he's got that extra pawn in the centre, plus he's got the bishop pair. Why is Rapport doing this? Well, he's slightly damaged the pawn structure here, and really the key thing is you can tell he's had this on his home computer. It's preparation, so even if the position's roughly equal, he still has this nagging pressure now that lasts throughout the game. So we had c4 setting up this Maroczy bind formation. Now e5 from Alireza, a good move, taking space in the centre. The queen retreated here, and now the knight comes to e7 and not to f6 because it's heading for this g6 square where it protects e5, also looks at f4, and now c5 was played by Rapport. This is the best move when you're running it with the engine. It immediately breaks up that big chunky pawn formation. Now you don't want to capture there, of course. Then the queens come off. This is bad for black. So Alireza goes knight g6. The pawn captured here. He retook with the queen. The queens now come off the board. Boo, boring. But okay, this is what Rapport is playing for here, is this nagging pressure now against A and C pawn. This is what he's going for. So bishop e3 developing, and now a great move by Alireza. He plays pawn to a5 here, not just some standard move like castles, and he has this defensive idea now of sitting the rook there to laterally defend this c pawn. So castles from Rapport, pawn to f6 now bolstered the centre. Although you weaken this diagonal, there's no light squared bishop for white to take advantage of that. Rook to c1 immediately targets this pawn, rook c6 defended, and now the knight came to d2 here, not to c3, because it's a very flexible square. It could be coming to b3 and then c5, could be coming to c4, pressuring here. And now bishop to e6 from Alireza, standard developing move, and here Rapport just doesn't rush the position. He goes knight to e1, he's improving this piece, bringing it into d3, and this is the nagging pressure I was talking about. The white minors are just a bit better than blacks. So we had king f7, knight d3, and here we can see these pieces look good. This one's not playing in the game in the same way here. So rook to d8 from Alireza. He's putting pressure down this file against this knight. And so king f1 from Rapport. He's preparing king e2 to defend that knight. And here Alireza can play the position a bit more slowly. So he could go bishop to e7, for example. Pawn h5 is another option. Pawn a4. But he plays a more forcing move here of bishop to b4, immediately opening the d-file, attacking this knight, and asking white the question, okay, do you want to take this one straight away? I'll recapture with my pawn, repair these ones, even though I've given up the bishop pair. I've got the open d-file. It's not to say it's better really for either player by too much here, but it would have clarified the position. He doesn't just want to sit and wait. So after bishop b4, we didn't have takes on b4 by Rapport. Instead, king e2 was played. It holds the knight. Once again, when you run this with the engines, they just want to wait with rook b8 here. But Alireza goes for a more forcing move, knight to h4 here. Now it's an ugly looking move, but it attacks this pawn and it sets a trap. So if you go pawn to g3 here, can you see the way to take advantage of this blunder? Well, the follow-up move is bishop to g4 check. Now after white blocks that one, well, you'd love to take this pawn, but it's defended by the knight and the king. So what happens if you eliminate the knight? Well, now if that one's recaptured, you simply win a pawn here, however you want to capture it. And if instead you actually take the bishop here, well, now we take the rook on c1, black's won an exchange. So this is the trap that Alireza was setting. So we didn't have pawn g3. Now the knight took on b4, pawn recaptured, and only now pawn to g3. There's no more bishop takes d2, so the knight has to come back, and now bishop c5 was played, nagging edge for white still in this position here. So this pawn is attacked. Now you can't actually take this one on a2, even though you've got two pieces converging on it. However you take, pawn b3 will be coming, supported by the knight, and then you trap in one of those pieces. It's not good to walk into that pin. So instead this pawn was defended by the rook, and now Rapport has to make progress somehow here, so he plays pawn to a3, Alireza captures that one, the rook recaptured here, no time to take on b2 with the black rook, because the rook on a6 is attacked, and so Alireza defended it here, and now many different moves for white. You can put a rook here, a rook here. Instead we have this slightly more forcing way to play. Rapport goes knight to c4, looking to hop into d6. Alireza really doesn't want to live with that one, so he chops off on c4, the rook recaptures, and now he starts bringing this knight back around, looking to re-enter the game. And now a nice nudging move from Rapport, rook to b3, and it really highlights some of the challenges of the black position here. So the rook's invading on b7, but you can't cover your 7th rank with the rook. The bishop covers that square. You can't go rook e8 here, coming here because the bishop covers that square. So it's just really tricky now for Alireza. So the knight came to e6, hits that bishop, but we had check first, the king ducked back, now the bishop dropped to e3, and here Alireza swings across to the open d file. He wants to support this knight, jumping into d4, but another great move by Rapport. He goes pawn to f4 here, getting those kingside pawns going, looking to start pressuring this e5 pawn. And again, you can play slowly here as black, things like pawn to h5, but Alireza doesn't want to hang around. He loves to play directly, so he jumps the knight into d4 with check. It's difficult to live with that one, so the bishop chopped off, the pawn recaptured, and now a really classy move from Rapport. He plays king to d2 here, and just to show you why king to d3 isn't so good, blockading the pawn, well, now rook to a1 is good. This is the move that Alireza played, and in this position it makes a lot of sense, because now you're actually swinging behind here to check the king. So say the rook takes on c6 here, well now you can check. The king's forced to either go to c2 or e2, let's say c2 here, and now you swing here, you attack that pawn, and after the rook doubles on the 7th, threatening g7, well now you can flick in this check. After the king goes somewhere, we're taking here. Now white can still secure a draw here. It's not to say white is losing or anything like that, but this gives Alireza equality, leads to the draw here. And this is a really important variation, because if we run back to the position after king to d2, Alireza plays this same idea, so he now invades with rook a1, but here it's suddenly not good at all, because he gets the same variation but a tempo down, and that's now much better for white. Now when you run this really deep with the strongest Stockfish engine, which chess.com were using in the studio, well then it shows this to be a massive blunder. The eval bar swings loads. As you can see on screen now, it doesn't swing as much on this weaker engine here. So they were calling this huge blunder, but from a human perspective here, I don't see this as such a crazy blunder. It's kind of logical why he went for this. He didn't want to sit passive, babysitting pawns, very tough position, so he went for activity here. So I don't think this was quite the blunder they were making it out to be in the studio in human terms. So okay, rook a1 played. Now we had this pawn snapped off. The rook came to h1 here, and now the rook doubled. Alireza takes here with check. King d3, and now he goes pawn g6, because this rook now at least holds the h7 pawn, and Rapport's not instantly winning one of those ones on the 7th. But we can see he's got the pressure here, and now pawn to e5 comes, and he's getting his pawn marching so much faster than Alireza's. That's the thing about this whole variation, is the king blockades this pawn. It's still on d4, you know, it's not on d2 like some of the other lines I showed. So rook to h3 now from Alireza. He targets the g3 pawn. So Rapport goes king to e4, marching that one in. And just to show you why you can't go d3 immediately here, Well, you could chuck in a check, king h8, and then you can always swing a rook back to this d file here and pick up that pawn. So that's why you can't get too hasty with that d pawn push. So coming back here, we didn't have d3. Alireza took on g3. We now had this check, king h8, and now this pawn drops. The rook left the h pawn when it captured on g3. King g8, king f4 hit the rook. It jumped into e3 now, so it comes behind this passed pawn which is trying to run. Now Rapport checked, the king came to f8, and we had a series of checks here. You can't come to e8, by the way, or then the rook swings away and you're actually getting mated on the back rank here, so you do have to be very careful. So the king came back, we had a couple more checks here, and now again in this position, the computer really doesn't like how Rapport plays, so it wants to swing the rook away, say to b7 here, keep that pressure along the rank, and then actually get this b pawn going with something like this. That's how it wants to maintain the pressure in this position. It's saying that black would have to go rook d5, start pressuring this pawn. All very complex, quite subtle. That was the way to go, but it's really not easy to see this. So instead of this, Rapport didn't swing that way to b7. He actually checked again on f7. The king came here, one more check, and then he picked up this pawn on g6 instead. But now Alireza can get rook to e2 here, so he's moved that rook away from the king's attack, and now he's preparing to push his d pawn, try and get that counterplay going. So we had pawn e6 from Rapport. Alireza now goes rook e8, he comes behind that pawn. We had rook h6 check, king g8, another check here, the king came back, and now this one doubled, holding that pawn. Now once again, d3 is apparently the best move, rook e7 not so good, because king f5 can come, but it's very complicated, not easy for the players to see this. Rapport doesn't go king f5, he goes pawn to b4, logical looking move, and now Alireza can get pawn to d3. He's marching that one down. Yes, he's a pawn down, but he should have enough counterplay here. So the rook came to g3, preparing to round up that pawn. It came down to d2. Now we had another check, and this one ducked across just in time to save the black king. We had captures on h7, king recaptures, and now rook d3 comes behind Alireza's pawn, and we're about to have a liquidation, e for d pawn here. So king g6 played, king f3 hit the rook, it took on e6, white took here, the king came to f6, and we now had just a couple more moves here, the rook e1, rook d4, and here after king to e6, the players agreed a draw. Once again, this is a theoretical draw because although white has the pawn, black is active enough to actually stop it, so they didn't play out all the moves here. So Alireza holds on just like he did yesterday, 2 draws with black, not such a bad start. Hopefully he can do something with white in tomorrow's round. Now if you want to know the standings, they're on screen now, so we can see that Fabi and Jan are ahead at this moment. They've had a draw and a win. Naka actually won today as well, fantastic game from him, and if you weren't aware, he actually recaps his own games each night on his channel, so do check those ones out, they're absolutely fantastic. I hope you enjoyed this game. Do consider subscribing if you never want to miss a future video, and see another amazing game between Alireza and Richard Rapport, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.